On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher."
Welcome back to another week where we're journeying through the Gospel of Mark together. This week we have really seen Jesus showing some things about himself, and we see some insights into God that are absolutely beautiful. Ash, how have you been going this week with the readings?
Well, this week, there's a lot of things that I've studied before and actually preached sermons on, which actually made it harder.
Yeah.
But I actually enjoyed the challenge, and the reason why I enjoyed the challenge is because it forced me to go deeper. And
cool.
I didn't want to just rehash things that I knew or I'd learned before, but I wanted to kind of see what's new here.
Yeah.
And I mean, Rosie and myself, so we do the devotion in the morning and we go through it, and then in the evenings we share the things that we've learned.
Yeah, awesome.
And I actually find that the whole kind of what did you learn, that kind of dialogue, talking with someone, much like what we're doing now, has actually stimulated more discovery than what I've just had in the morning. And so I've really benefited from the whole discussion at the end of the day. And Rosie...
And what I've actually found, because we do the same thing, it kind of solidifies in my mind to remember what I learnt that morning.
Yes.
You know, like going back over it at night, then days later, I can remember what I read. Whereas I think when I don't have that sharing moment, it's gone.
Yeah. And I think when you communicate something with somebody, it forces you to kind of compartmentalize and to process your thoughts and communicate it in a way that they can understand. And so you've got to understand what you've learnt in order to communicate it. There's not just these abstract thoughts that are sometimes disconnected, but it's this streamlined kind of, this is what I've learnt and this is the message I want to share.
I think that's a really good point. So we've been doing the same thing as a family though. So Moses, who's 7, Noah, who's 9, Yelena's still a bit too young she can't read, but they've been doing their morning devotion, same with Ma. And then in the evening, we share with each other. And, you know, a lot of the times people believe something and then they're asked why. And they're like, well, Doug said it. Or and what Doug said or what you say or whatever preacher it is said, it makes sense, but they don't know how to communicate that to someone else.
Yeah.
As a family, like we were saying, having this moment where you have to share what you found, I think it kind of makes it more your own.
Yeah.
And even Moses, who's 7, he's come up with some very simple insights that have been profound. And the cool thing that what we've done, we come together with our pens as well. And if someone's discovered something that we missed, it's like, oh, that's awesome. And we add it to our things. So there'll be some things today that I shared that like Noah shared. I was like, oh man, that's actually quite profound. That's mine now.
Just have to give him the credit for that.
But I'm just saying, like as a family, it's a really neat thing. And also it just gives an opportunity to really affirm my kids.
Yeah.
With even the most simplest of discoveries so that they get excited about discovering more.
I think what it also communicates is that God speaks to all of us.
100%, yeah.
You know, we study the scripture, we see things through our own experiences, but God can speak to all of us and reveal things from his word, which I love.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, let's talk about some things that we've learnt today. So the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee.
So I think this story absolutely pivots the Gospel of Mark into another direction.
Yeah.
So prior to this, we've seen him revealing to the scribes and Pharisees who he is, and they completely reject him. And now there is this complete revealing to the disciples that begins. And I think this story really kind of unpacks that in the 4 questions that are through the story.
Yeah. So those four questions.
Yeah.
The question, where... they asked Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, don't you care that we're perishing? The second one, where Jesus says, why are you so afraid? The third one where he says, have you still no faith? And then their final question, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? They're the questions you're thinking of?
Yeah. And the first 2, as I was reading this, they seem silly, right? It's like coming to Jesus. Do you even care that we're dying?
Yes.
It's like, of course he does. Like that seems like such a silly question. And then Jesus asking them, why are you afraid? Like, They're dying.
But I mean, if I had to resonate with any of those questions, I would probably side more with the disciples, because like from all appearances, Jesus is asleep in the middle of a storm. These guys know how to deal with a boat in the midst of storms. So from all appearances, like, it seems that their question is quite legitimate.
For sure, because these aren't massive ships. Jesus was up the back of the ship seeing this, like, well, he was asleep, but I don't know how he didn't get wet and whatever. So it'd be this feeling of, what's he doing?
Yeah.
But I feel like they both kind of are silly. Like, why are you afraid? We're dying.
Yeah.
But then Jesus asks that third question, which I think answers and shows why those other ones are relevant. He says, have you still no faith? And I actually circled the still there.
Yes, yes.
It's like these guys have been seeing this stuff, but they haven't allowed it to have true faith.
Yeah.
Or grow into that, spring of faith. But like, do you still have no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said one to another, who then is this that even the winds and the sea obey him?
Yes.
And I think this question is that pivot. Like from now, then it's like, okay, who is he as he's revealing himself to the disciples?
It's a revelation. And I think that question is quite a powerful question from the disciples. They're trying to grapple with who this man is. And I think within themselves and with their knowledge of Scripture and who God is, they recognize that they're not just in the presence of any ordinary man.
Yes.
They would be perfectly acquainted with Old Testament literature and who is the only one that has control over the wind and the waves.
Yep. It's God.
I mean, in Psalms 89 verses, 8 and 9, it says, Lord God of hosts, when the wind and the wave rage, you still them. And so here they are having their own kind of Moses experience, but in a boat, where they recognize that they're on holy ground.
Yeah, man.
And they're more afraid. This is what caught me. They're more afraid when the storm is quiet than what they were in the midst of the storm.
Yeah.
And it's because the presence of God is quite a scary thing when you recognize who you are, because you see who he is. And they're seeing who he is, and this revelation, like you said, this transition. And when they see who God is, they immediately see who they are. And it's like those Old Testament experiences, woe is me, for I am undone, for I have seen the Lord. I'm a man of unclean lips, born in the midst of an unclean people. There's this kind of experience of their humanity in the presence of his divinity. Yeah. And it's just amazing. Like when I consider like the revelations of God in the Old Testament, there's thunder, there's lightning and stuff, and all that was there. But when he stops all that stuff, and it's the still small voice, this is where I am. And it's just such a powerful kind of expression, story of faith and the power of God.
So after this experience, they go to they arrive on land, and there's a demoniac there.
Yes.
Now here is something that I hadn't seen before. Before we get to that, I guess, do you want to just kind of summarize the story for if anyone hasn't read it yet?
So I think it'd probably be good to kind of talk about the demoniac just a little bit. So Jesus arrives on the shore. Here's this guy. He's been living amongst the tombs. He's possessed by demons. He cries out. He cuts himself. He's been bound with chains. But when, the presence comes upon him, the demonic presence, he just breaks those chains.
Yeah.
He's naked. In terms of like hopeless cases in the Bible,
it doesn't get much more hopeless.
This is probably the worst situation out of all of them. And so Jesus comes, and this guy runs to Jesus and falls at his feet. And then he goes to speak, but the demon speaks on his behalf. And Jesus delivers him. Yeah.
Now, something that did jump out at me in verse 3, he lived amongst the tombs, and it says, and no one could bind him anymore. So in other words, there was a time where he could be bound. But now he can't even anymore, not even with a chain.
Yeah.
And so it seems to indicate like we used to be able to bind this guy with ropes.
Yes.
But the evil's been growing. His power's been getting bigger and bigger. And later on in the story, we realize that when Jesus asks him, what's your name? He says, we are legion, for we are many, right? So like, it seems like that over time, he's not just been bad and stayed bad, but he's been bad and getting worse.
Like nobody wakes up one day and that's who they are. It's this series of decisions and stuff that leads you to a place of utter despair.
100%. Now, here's the other kind of thing. It's verse what is it, verse 4, the end of it. No one had the strength to subdue him. Jesus did.
Yeah.
But it was a completely different type of strength.
Yes.
See, when they were asking, no one has their strength, it's to bind him. And they didn't realize that there is a strength that is not about binding, but about freeing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And this is kind of like what Noah, and now as we were talking, came out. He says, like, what we often think is strength,
Yeah.
we don't realize that something completely different is stronger. So like he said, so rather than being strong and punching someone back harder, you can actually be stronger by being willing to forgive them first. You know, and it's like this, we have this idea of strength is about binding, whereas Jesus shows here that the strength that he brings is stronger than anyone else, but it's about freeing,
Yes.
about liberating.
Deliverance. You know, and that jumped out to me as well. Like, this guy was bound. You know, he would break the bonds. It appeared as if nothing could actually hold him down. You know, this supernatural demonic activity was the most powerful thing in the region. And I mean, why was he bound? Why was he placed in the tomb? Because nobody wanted him around the town.
Yeah.
And who bound him?
The people of the town.
They were terrified of this guy.
Yeah.
And I just love this picture, and I know I'm probably jumping ahead in the story, but anyway, it's like when the townspeople come out, and then in verse 15 it says they come to Jesus and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. See,
They were afraid again.
the first time that this guy had ever been properly bound
Yes.
is in the presence of Jesus Christ. And I was thinking of that verse earlier in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus says that, you know, he binds the strong man, where he's communicating that I am the stronger man here still. And I love that point that you brought up about, you know, Jesus doesn't bind him, like he doesn't bind the devil, you know, with chains or anything. He liberates this guy. And this guy of his own volition, of his own choice, is sitting at the feet of Jesus in his right mind.
Yeah.
And the townspeople are afraid.
Yeah. All right. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Do you want to? I want to share what I've never seen before. Maybe you've seen this. Maybe this isn't new to you, but it was new to me.
Yes.
Chronologically, verse 8 happens before verse 7. And that changes this story so much for me.
Yeah.
So verse 7, we'll start in verse 6. It says, and when he saw Jesus from afar, so the demoniac sees Jesus from far away, yeah?
Yeah.
He ran down and fell before him, and crying out with a loud voice said, what have you to do with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Why did he do this? Well, verse 8 gives us the answer. It says, for, and the word for is something I've missed.
Yeah.
It says, for he was what?
Saying to him.
Saying. He did this, why? For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. So in other words, while the man was afar, Jesus was saying, come out of him, you unclean spirit.
Yes.
And that's what caused the demoniac to come and run and have this confrontation with Jesus, right? And I think it's such a cool thing that before the demoniac even saw him, Jesus was already actively freeing him.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think that's so cool. I've never seen that. Maybe you have, but like chronologically, Jesus initiated this.
And you could even back up even more. You can say Jesus left the safety of the crowd in Galilee, crossed this terrible storm to reach this one man. So even before he got to the
it's true, because all he does is free him and then leave again.
And then bails. Like, the thing is, like, while he's on the shore, that's not the beginning. The beginning is way before then.
Yeah.
And it just shows that Jesus leaves the crowd and the safety of the crowds to reach a soul.
Yeah.
And
but see, for years, I read this and it felt like Jesus was saying this in response to what the demoniac said.
To the conversation. Yeah.
It's the demon-possessed man said this, so Jesus said this. But no.
Yeah.
Jesus was saying, get out of him. And then he runs down and he begs him, please don't torture me.
It just shows you there's no contest. Like, you know.
Dude.
So this guy...
Anyway, I thought that was cool, man. I was just like, dude, Jesus was freeing him before he ever asked, before he ever saw him. Jesus was already actively get out of that man.
That's cool. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. It just jumped out at me. I was like, oh, wow, look at that. And just a simple word, for, but it changes the chronology.
Yeah.
And it changes it to where Jesus is not responding. He's initiating.
I just love how there's no contest.
Yeah.
And we see that so far in the gospel. Like, there is no contest when it comes to Jesus and the demons.
No, never. They're at his mercy.
They recognize who he is. They're at his mercy.
Yeah.
And then, like, we know how this whole story ends. We're going to be talking about the cross in following weeks and stuff. And Jesus subjected himself to that. And he had full power over that.
Yes.
And this is just a bit of a window here of what Jesus does in delivering people. But as a consequence of him delivering people, he hands himself over to deliverance.
Yeah.
Like, he's delivered himself into the hands of men. You know, he wasn't forced against his will. There's no contest at any single point. He hands his life over.
That's such a
Yeah.
mind-boggling
Yeah.
thing, because he's God. And
Exactly.
yet he's voluntarily laid himself out.
And I think, like, what I'm looking for in all these stories, and I see it just time after time repeated, is you just see the shadow of the cross. You know, I think sometimes we think, you know, the love of God's revealed in the cross, which it is, but you see kind of this exchange, this God who's seeking and saving the lost, this God who's putting himself in the place of sinners to redeem and to rescue and to ransom the sinners. And we see that here in the story. Something that jumped out to me in the story of the demoniac is I like to see words that are repeated.
Yeah, yeah.
You probably have noticed that. You guys have probably noticed that too. There's a word, and it's beg and begged. So in verse 12, what you see the demons begging Jesus to send them into the pigs.
Yep.
And then in verse 17, you see the townspeople begging Jesus to depart from their region.
Yeah.
And Jesus gives them what they're asking for.
Yeah.
But then the third instance of begging is the man who had been possessed by a demon, and he begs Jesus that he might go with him, but Jesus says no.
Yeah.
So the two instances of people begging, which, you know, they're not on Jesus' side, he gives them what they want. But then the guy who he's delivered, and it actually seems as if it's a good thing for him to go with Jesus. Like when you think of evangelism, like a new disciple.
Yeah, 100%.
You disciple him up. But what's good for him isn't necessarily what's best for him. And since he's surrendered himself to Jesus, he's aligned himself with Jesus' will. And when Jesus says no, even though he's begging, the expression and the example of a disciple is following Jesus even when it doesn't make sense. You've surrendered yourself completely. The demons hadn't surrendered themselves to Jesus.
Yeah.
The townspeople hadn't surrendered themselves to Jesus, and they were begging for what they wanted, and they were given what they wanted. But here is a disciple of Jesus that's begging for what he thinks is right, and Jesus says, no, that's not right for you. And he submits to that. And I think in my life, there are many things that I would have liked, but God said no. And I'm glad that he said no.
Yes.
Because he knew what was best for me.
Good point.
And he says, I've got a mission for you. I want you to go. And on that, do you find it interesting that Jesus hasn't sent his disciples out yet? We get that in next week's study. But the first person that Jesus sends out in the Gospel of Mark
It's the demoniac.
is a Gentile demoniac. And
yeah, man. That's powerful.
Yeah, it's insane.
So something that kind of and so we're told that throughout do you pronounce it Decapolis?
Yep.
Yeah. So we're told that he went away and he proclaimed in Decapolis how much Jesus has done from him, and look at the result. And everyone marveled.
Yes. How could you not?
Now, it's not till the end of chapter 7
Yeah.
Jesus comes back to Decapolis.
It's packed.
It's packed, and people are bringing people to him for healing, and he's able to do mighty works there. Why? Because this guy went proclaiming.
He did what Jesus told him to do.
Now, here's kind of a couple of things and points that jumped out at me. When the townspeople came, they heard a testimony of what happened from the pig herders or shepherds, or I don't know what they'd be called, right? And the town people reject it. They reject Jesus. So they heard a testimony about what Jesus did, but they heard it not from someone who's experienced Jesus, just someone who's witnessed someone who's experienced Jesus.
Yeah.
And that testimony didn't have power.
Yeah.
But when they came and heard the same testimony from someone who's experienced the change, that testimony had change-forming power.
And
I think this is a real challenge to us.
yes.
often we think that it's powerful to share stories of other people's experiences with Jesus. But what Jesus wants to do with us is to give us our own experiences with him so that we can share what Jesus has done to me and with me and through me. And I think that those testimonies are far more powerful than the ones where you just hear of someone else's experience with God.
And just parrot it. Absolutely. Like, I think, when I think of this story, he didn't even necessarily need to say anything. He just, like Jesus says, go to your friends, go home to your friends. You imagine him walking into the house in his right mind.
I know, man.
He wouldn't even need to say anything. And they would have known there's something, like, we know what this guy was. Like, we know. We probably bound him. And now he's evangelizing in our cities.
Yes.
And not only that, like, how much did this guy know?
Yeah, I know. He hasn't heard one sermon.
No, he hasn't. And so Jesus says, okay, I'm going to get you to share what you do know.
Yes.
You know me and you know what I've done for you. You know what you were. You know what you now are. And I want you to share that story. What the Lord has done for you. Jesus equates himself as the Lord.
Yeah, good find.
I want you to communicate to these people your story. And you know what's so powerful about that? Every Christian has a story.
Yes.
And since we all have a story, we all have something to share. And I think sometimes people wait until they feel as if they know enough before they share. Mm-hmm. If you've met Jesus, if you've been with Jesus, then you have something to share, absolutely. And that's what this guy did.
Yes. Here's the other kind of thought that I had. The demons begged him to go into to the pigs. As soon as they got into the pigs, what they do? They ran into the ocean and drowned them.
Yes.
Yeah. So this was a satanically originated idea. If we can destroy these two... By the way, the first century was not the world we have of 7 billion people. A 2,000 pig farm is massive.
Huge, massive level.
By the way, that's kind of how we also know this is predominantly a Gentile region because Jews were not eating pigs.
Yeah.
So you got this massive pig farm that would have catered for this region with pigs because that's a lot of pigs.
Yeah.
And so Satan's like, please let us go to these pigs. Well, the demons are asking to go to the pigs. They destroy the pigs. Turn the people against Jesus, right? They're angry. They've just lost all their income and they've lost their food. And this kind of plan of Satan's to turn the people away from Jesus ended up being an act of mercy on God's part to remove an obstacle that would have kept them from being able to follow Jesus. Right? Because as they came to a knowledge of truth, they would have had to give up pig and they would have had to give up this business. But they don't have to now give it up because it's already been removed for them. You know what I mean? And I just feel like the success of the ministry of the demoniac, it would have had 1 or 2 less obstacles that people needed to overcome because these pigs got removed.
Yeah.
And often we find throughout the Gospels, and especially the highlight of this is the cross, that what Satan intends for harm, God is able to use that very thing to accomplish his purpose or help his purpose. Yeah. And I just kind of saw that there. I thought that was kind of
it's like Satan always overreaches.
Yeah. It's like he's playing checkers while God's playing chess kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's a cool point.
Yeah.
Good point. We should probably go to the next story, which is a pack story.
It's massive. I think we can only share like a few points or this podcast might blow out.
Yes.
But go for it. You share what kind of jumped out at you.
There's a lot. And I think that we should just run through very quickly what's in this story, just for the sake of time. So we have a man by the name of Jairus. So Jesus hops back on the boat. You know, he respects the wishes, he respects the will of the townspeople that ask him to leave, hops back on the boat, goes back to the other side, and there's a crowd again, ready for Jesus. And a man by the name of Jairus, who was the ruler of the synagogue, comes at him and falls at his feet and says, hey, my daughter is dying. She's at the point of death, and I want you to come heal. And so Jesus says, yeah. So on their journey to that place, there's this woman that comes along, and she has had an issue of blood for 12 years, and she goes to the doctors, she gets worse. And she's at a point of desperation. She thinks, if I can just touch his robe, his cloak, then I'll be made whole.
Yep.
She does that. She's made whole. Jesus stops. The little girl dies. Jesus goes and raises the little girl from the dead.
Yeah.
2 stories condensed into one story, really. But
Well, it's like one story gets interrupted by another.
yeah,
So the story of the woman who was unwell is sandwiched between Jairus's
yeah,
in the middle of it. And I think there's actually a tremendous lesson in this whole thing because he was a leader of the synagogue. Generally not fans of Jesus.
yeah. Particularly after the Pharisees from Jerusalem come and say, he has a demon.
But it's got desperate.
Yeah,
And so he's willing to try something that he wasn't willing to try before because things have got desperate.
yeah,
Which, by the way, just a side note, it pretty much doesn't matter where in the world you're listening to this podcast from. This world has gone to chaos. And we need to remember that consistently throughout Scripture, as desperation increases, people's openness to try something that they weren't open to try before increases too.
it's true.
And I just want to challenge all of us. We got friends, we have neighbors, we've got communities we're a part of. And you may have tried to witness to people before, just like Jesus tried to reach the people of the synagogue before.
It's like the hard
And
soil.
we're not open. But they might be open now. And with COVID or protests or whatever that's going on, don't forget that God is still at work and that there very well might be people who are open to hear God and try God now that weren't a year ago.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And so just a reminder that although things might be a challenge, God is still at work.
100%.
And so a challenge opened up Jairus' heart to, all right, let me try Jesus.
Yeah.
And he obviously didn't come to him first because she's at the point of death.
And he doesn't just come to him alone like Nicodemus.
Yeah.
He comes to Jesus while Jesus is in the midst of a crowd.
Yes, good point.
So, yeah, man, let's talk about the woman first.
Okay.
So what are some things that jumped out to you?
Well, I think these stories are very much connected and not two separate stories.
Yeah.
So he wants Jesus to come and lay hands on him, on his daughter, so that she could be made well and live. Jesus starts heading there with him, but there's a massive crowd. And then all of a sudden, he gets touched. Well, the edge of his garment gets touched.
Yeah.
And he feels
Power go out of him.
power go out of him. And the lady that touched him feels the blood flow dry up.
Yes.
And then he says, "Who touched my garments?"
Yeah.
The disciples missed the question. Because when they repeated to him and they said to him, and this is down in verse 31, it says, and his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'"
Yeah.
He didn't say, "Who touched me?" He said, "Who touched my garment?"
Yeah.
Indicating he knows.
Yeah.
Because he knows. He knows everything.
The difference between a casual touch and a touch of faith.
Yeah, but Jesus knows everything. He wasn't like, "Who is it? Who is it? I don't know who it is."
Yeah.
But he knows someone didn't touch him. Someone touched the garment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's one person in that crowd that was specifically there to touch at least the garment.
Yeah. And here she is cowering for fear because she's broken all the laws because she's unclean. And she's been unclean for 12 years.
Yes.
She shouldn't be there. And she knows she shouldn't be there. The same point with Jairus, desperation. Reaching out to Jesus. If I can just touch him. I'm prepared to break all the rules.
According to Levitical law, what unclean people touch
becomes unclean.
becomes unclean.
Yeah.
And so there is a way to interpret this in a Jewish mindset. He's like, "Oh, power's left me. Who touched my garment?
Yes. Yeah.
Have I just made him unclean?" But she knows she's healed.
But Jesus, this is the crazy thing in the story. Jesus stops. And, you can just imagine Jairus and all this. Like, "Jesus, why are you stopping? Let's keep going." Who touched you? It's a ridiculous question to ask, from their perspective. And he's like, no, who touched me? And I don't think it was like this, "Okay, guys, who touched me?"
Yeah.
It was me. I think that there was this pause because you can kind of see that. It says, and
100%.
he looked around
Yes.
to see who had done it. That's after he says, "Who touched me?" And then this woman comes in fear and says, yeah, it was me. And then it says that she tells the whole truth, which means that she shares that story.
She's sharing a testimony.
Yeah, who she was,
Yes.
the fact that she shouldn't have been there.
Yes.
And then here's Jairus waiting in the wings, just like the whole story. Do we need to hear the whole story? Can't we just have the the abridged version? But she shares the whole story. And then Jesus is like, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace.
Yes.
And
while he's speaking, while he's saying this to her, Jairus is getting news.
yeah.
She's dead.
And Jesus overhears it. And it's I like to look up some words in the Greek sometimes
awesome.
when we're looking through this, and the word in the Greek literally means ignore. And so it says, but ignoring what they said, Jesus said to him, do not fear, only believe. You could also read that, but ignoring what they said, Jesus said, it's like he redefines reality. He's like, just believe. I know that this is what has happened, but please, for my sake and for yours, ignore it, because I'm going to do something.
Now, here's why I say these are not disconnected stories. It's a big ask to believe it's going to be fine after she's dead.
Yes.
But what has Jairus just heard?
She's dead.
No. Just before that, what did he just hear?
Oh, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.
He heard a testimony.
Yeah.
Don't miss this. He has a 12-year-old at home. He has a 12-year-old daughter at home who's deathly ill. And he's just heard a woman who's had an infirmity for 12 years.
Yes.
That no one could heal. And this lady touched his garment and she was healed, and Jesus didn't even lay hands on her.
Yeah.
He was asking, come lay hands on my daughter. Jesus didn't even lay hands on her, and he just heard this testimony. She testified that she has been made well of this impossible disease that no one could do anything about for 12 years.
Yeah.
And right after he hears this testimony of what faith was able to do, he hears his 12-year-old died.
Yeah.
And then Jesus turns to him and says, just believe.
Yeah.
How on earth was he able to believe? Because he did.
The only thing he would cling on to is the story of what happened to that woman. And it's like when you think of these stories, they're similar in almost every respect. This young girl was 12. This woman had this issue for 12 years. They were both female. This woman was unclean. This little girl died, which rendered her unclean. Just similarities at every single point, but there's one major difference, or there's a couple of major differences. This woman comes from the behind.
Yes.
Jairus comes from the front boldly. This woman reaches out in faith, and her story is the very springboard by which Jairus believes and actually sees what faith looks like.
Yes, but don't miss verse 27. It just adds to this. It says, she had heard reports about Jesus and came up behind him and touched him. So don't miss this. She hears testimonies of what Jesus was able to do, and that gives her belief,
Confidence.
to try.
Yes. Yeah.
Then she shares a testimony of what Jesus was able to do, and that enables Jairus
To believe.
and try.
Yeah.
It's this domino effect of people experiencing Jesus, sharing Jesus, and that creates belief in Jesus, which lets people experience Jesus, and then they share that testimony.
Yeah.
And it's this cycle that every single one of us as believers are a part of, and that is we need to share the experience we have in Jesus. Why? Because your sharing of your experience in Jesus will be the seed that grows into someone else having the faith to experience Jesus. Faith is contagious. And so sharing that faith enables someone else to experience their own experience and faith with Jesus.
Faith inspires faith.
Yes.
And it's interesting, hey, like when you connect all these stories that we've looked at today, so the story of the Sea of Galilee and the disciples, the demoniac, and then this story here, you see this similar theme. The disciples were afraid. They were afraid after they saw what Jesus did, and he questions their faith. You see the townspeople afraid when they saw this demoniac in his right mind at the feet of Jesus as a response of this man's faith. You see this woman afraid when Jesus says, who touched me?
Yes.
Then you see Jairus, and Jesus' response to Jairus in verse 36, do not fear, only believe. So basically we have two choices. We can either fear or we can have faith.
And you see that in all these stories, that there's this kind of this point where the believer's faith comes into question or their faith is challenged.
Yes.
And they have to trust in God in the midst of the difficult situation and the adversity that they're in front of, clinging only to him, believing in impossible things and believing that all things are possible through him.
Yes.
And they're clinging only to Jesus and what he said and who he is. And I think that this is the expression of what faith is.
Yes.
And when Jesus says you need to have faith as small as a mustard seed, he's not talking about the quantity of faith that you have.
Yeah.
Because if he was trying to focus on the quantity...
Which, by the way, is the intro to this, the parable of the mustard seed.
Exactly. Like it's not the quantity, but it's where that faith is placed.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, if that faith is placed on me, amazing things can happen.
Yes.
But you just have to believe.
Yes.
And what's so cool about this is, my faith can inspire somebody else to put their faith in Jesus Christ as well.
Yeah.
And experience the things that I've experienced. And it's just this beautiful thing, that we help each other. The more we share, the more we testify, the more we grow, and the more our witness spreads, and the more God does wonderful, amazing things.
Awesome. I think you might like this because it uses the same words repeatedly.
Yes, go for it.
The demoniac, he comes and he falls down before Jesus.
Yes.
Jairus comes,
Falls down.
falls at Jesus' feet. The woman comes,
Falls down.
falls at Jesus' feet, falls down before him. Everyone who comes and falls down before him gets up freed, gets up healed, and gets up with a very real experience with God himself.
They're worshipping.
We need to fall down before Jesus, man.
Yeah.
Whatever the problem is, fall down before him.
Yes.
I think that's powerful, man.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful place to finish.
Yeah.
So, guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. We pray that you were blessed as we studied the scriptures, and we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless. Hey guys, we don't have any questions for this week, but we got some challenges. The first challenge is to share a story of faith where God's come through for you with somebody else. And the second challenge is for you not only to do this devotion in the morning for yourself, but if you're in a household and you've got family in your household, it doesn't even necessarily need to be that. If you know somebody, to actually share throughout the day, probably in the evening, the things that you've learned and to really discuss those things together. We look forward to catching you guys next week. God bless.